Hello, hello. Mm. Hello, everyone. My name is Braden Toronto Brooks. I'm the founder and owner of Creative Overhaul, a podcast management agency looking to connect valuable information with ambitious individuals. Today is episode number 2. I will be covering all of the top pillars of content marketing, some examples of how we've been able to use them, and which platforms you should focus on to disperse all of these types of content. So let's start with covering the pillars of content marketing specific to the podcast space. So first, we're going to be talking about direct promotional content. So for this could be email or any social media platform. And as we're starting off, this is probably going to be one of the easier ones to understand if you're talking about being a podcast host and creating content. So direct promotional content can be anything promotional that helps your audience understand the value of the podcast episode that you're going to launch or just launched. So these can be seen as graphics that show the validity and the authenticity of the guest that is coming in. These could be an email that displays the credibility of the business that the guest is attached to, or anything that can translate to a potential listener that they will learn something valuable by tuning in. So usually these pieces of content are for people that did not tune in when they got the notification as a subscriber on the podcast avenue of their choice, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any of those. And then they tune in because they are following you on a social media platform or you've subscribed to their email list. They will be able to receive any of that content that you're pushing out there. And maybe some of it is relatable to them and they see there's some value and they give it a second shot. This can also apply to people that follow you on social media, but don't fully understand the value that you're providing on your podcast platforms yet. So these can be very valuable. Some of the graphics can be just a simple thumbnail with a title that talks about, in one sentence, what the podcast is going to be about. You could also potentially do like a bio post that talks about the guest and what do they bring to the table, almost like a resume for them. Um, and then you can also go into some direct promotional content, which is technically some short form video content to provide some golden nuggets that were talked about on the podcast. And the second type of content that I want to talk about is blog posts. So these can be written about topics that you've already talked about on the podcast. For example, today we're talking about navigating content creation in the podcast industry. I can create a blog post talking about how short form video content might be the most important piece of content to focus on. So you can see how that ties into how we are using a podcast. For you guys, writing about topics talked about on the podcast works. You can also edit a version of a transcript of the podcast. So, for example, you can use a program, or if your podcast host actually has a transcription option, you can use that transcript to edit it and make sure that it fully makes sense for your website or wherever you're going to publish the blog post. Maybe you'll paraphrase it and use it on LinkedIn. It allows you to multi-purpose use your podcast content on a lot of different platforms. Next, we're going to be talking about video, but specifically, we'll talk about long form video. So this can be IGTV, this can be YouTube, this can be the Facebook Watch platform. So these will primarily be your podcast recordings and any long form content that you produce that supports the podcast. So, for example, if you're in the real estate industry and you're hosting a real estate podcast, this can be a tour of your newly acquired property. This can be supported by the podcast episode, of course. Maybe you're talking about all of these different acquisitions that you've done, and then you link directly a day or 2 days later to promote this YouTube video. If you're a car dealership, maybe you've just brought in 10, 20, 30 new vehicles and you want to talk about your new inventory. Maybe even a lawyer. Maybe your lawyer's office relocated and you want to come off as a friendly presence to your local neighborhood, and you want to show a little bit more personality on your socials, and that's why you can maybe link it to your podcast recording. So this provides a lot of value if you've built up a good base of people that want to see all the value. And this is a little bit harder to do because, again, for people to tune in for 20, 30, 40 minutes on the first listen is very hard to do. So you need to be able to provide value to them in quicker ways so that they understand how valued you are and want to tune in for that long. And that's where we're going to segue into short form video content, which can be housed on TikTok, YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels. So these, in tandem with the long form videos, what we're going to do is take important clips, whether that is 15 seconds, 30 seconds, even 60 seconds, of very important topics that we're going to be talking about. And we're going to take that directly from the podcast episode and share it in these short form video content places so that instead of listening to 30 to 40 minutes to get some value, these potential listeners can get value in a snap of your fingers. And it makes much more sense for people to start liking you up front and start gaining some trust and some credibility with you because they only have to listen in for a little bit of time to see if it's worth the listen. This can also happen if you feature on other podcasts, you can get those clips, or maybe you're just going to record yourself independently talking about the topic in your podcast niche. So, for example, as I was saying, if you're a real estate podcast and you want to take a tour of your newly acquired property, maybe your short clip can be 60 seconds of you going over the in-depth numbers of the price that you acquired it at, all of the renovations that you put into it, the amount that you're able to refinance it at, all of those important numbers that gain that credibility, that trust in the listener, which will end up getting them to want to listen to your long form video content. The next pillar that we're going to be exploring is the testimonials and reviews. So this can be done on Facebook, Instagram, or even LinkedIn. So these can be displayed in many different ways. I see them being done as videos, more so like in a case study type version, or a graphic, which is more so just a designed up screenshot of a review. And these can be published with the purpose to help guide a potential partner, a potential sale, even a potential listener to your desired outcome. So again, if you want as many listeners as possible, then the testimonial or review should support that. If you're looking to get a real estate sale or a car sale or a consultant call, then that testimonial or review needs to support that claim. These can be reviews directly, people that send you reviews on Google. These can be audio reviews. Maybe they sent you a voicemail. These can be video reviews. Maybe they sent you a video of themselves going over their product or service. Maybe they can even just be a direct review or testimonial on your podcast platforms. There's lots of different ways of going about it. We can talk a little bit more about how to get these in the future. But if you're already an established podcast or you're already an established business, these might be easier to come by and can generate some easy but very effective content. The next one is going to be a little bit more educational wise, which I covered is checklists, guides, or how-tos. So these can be basically displayed on websites and any social media. So what these are basically quick summaries or long descriptions to make things easier for your audience in terms of what your industry provides. So I gave this example to you guys. The goal would be to make the home buying process easier or feel like a friendly experience at a lawyer's office, translating to the potential customer that they can feel safe falling into your call to action. So basically, if you do a how-to video or if you do a guide or if you do a checklist, any piece of content that helps your audience understand a little bit more about your industry, then that's going to allow them to understand a little bit more about the value that you provide. So for you to be able to be a credible source in the industry, you need to provide value that allows your listeners to come to that conclusion, and then you get what you want, which is the attention that you've been looking for, which then would end up being a lead, potential sale, maybe just a listen. But those things you might have to educate your audience on the value that you provide and what you provide as a professional. And those are all of the key topics that you're probably going to want to cover them all. If you're going to be doing a podcast long form content, all of these things can be driven directly from the podcast. So, for example, I'm creating this podcast right now. I can create some direct promotional content if I don't have email subscribers, so I'm not going to be using that. But I can use my existing social media platform to directly talk about the knowledge that I'm providing. I can create a blog post off of the topics that I've talked about on this podcast, as well as I can create a transcript from this podcast to put on my blog and then paraphrase it to put on LinkedIn. Short form video content, I'm going to be probably pulling a couple clips out of this podcast to put on TikTok, YouTube Shorts, and Instagram Reels. It's very, very easy depending on the platform that you use. I use StreamYard and I can edit it directly after I click this big red button that says end recording. The long form video is as easy as this. Once I click end recording, I can publish it to wherever I want, make the edits accordingly. Testimonials and reviews are very hard to come by as a starter for a podcast, but if you already have an established business like I do, we already have those reviews and testimonials to exercise our trust and our authority. Checklist guides and how-tos. Again, if you're listening to our podcast, you probably don't need too much educational content to understand how valuable a podcast is. But when we're trying to promote on, let's just say, Twitter, or if we're trying to promote to an audience that doesn't necessarily listen to podcast as much as they should be, we might need to explain to them the value of listening into a podcast like ours. And in reality, all of these foundational pieces of content can be modified to cover all the types of content you promote. I bet you I didn't cover everything, but in terms of video, audio, graphics, direct promotional content, written content, this is going to cover the big bubble of everything. So at the end of the day, thank you so much for tuning in here. My name is Braden Toronto Brooks. I'm the founder and owner of Creative Overhaul. Thank you so much for tuning in. You can email me at btb@creativeoverhaul.ca or any of our social medias at Creative Overhaul or even our website at www.creativeoverhaul.ca. Thank you so much for listening to episode 2. We will see you in the next one. Thank you.